thank you, of course, for this fellowship, which has been amazing. I've learned so much, I've done so much, I've made hundreds of drawings, and there's, like hours and hours of dancing and all kinds of things I never even knew I had in me as a creative practice. So, and also because of the fellowship, I was able to have both official Brain Trust members and advisors at each one of the scales I'm going to give examples of throughout the talk. So at the scale of the one to self, or the mind and body, at the partner scale, and at the group scale. And that was really beautiful, and all of these people informed my thinking. And then these are kind of the texts I was reading a lot, but these are the ones in particular that also informed the work. So this is what I started at looking at. I was revisiting this adage that the greatest creativity comes from the most dire circumstances, asking people if they thought it was true, and digging into what else great creativity might come out of, especially wanting to tease out that come out of part, because even when great creativity does come out of a difficult situation, it's never automatic. I knew that there were forms of support that I could sort of look into and bring to the surface. And I was also looking for examples where a personal coping strategy was scaled up into a public catharsis. And you'll notice I'm not using the word art, both because I think personal coping strategies are often really creative and not called art, and so are elements of public catharsis. So rather, I'm using the word creativity. And the word that I had for when creativity does come out of a dire circumstance was survival creativity. I didn't think I made it up, like I thought it was in wide use. But then when I realized that I had to kind of come up with a definition, I ended up, okay, cool. I think you have the wrong slideshow, but we're gonna roll with it. So I ended up not so much defining it in words, but defining it by the way that it feels in the body to encounter it. So things like kind of air in a tight space, or a loosening even of the brain wrinkles, from some gestures that it can always be caught doing, like re-articulating ossified joints, inserting an alternative into that which it amends, and performing freedom and autonomy even within a carceral state. I've highlighted the ones that I have examples for in the talk. And then also the toolkit that it keeps returning to. And one of the nice things about sort of defining this by what it feels like, the moves it's making, and the tools it uses, is that this can also switch scales. So I spent my whole life collecting examples of this and making examples of this in my own work. And then I also have a lot of examples from the Houston scale and from the urban scale, because before this, most of my work is about people's capacity to reimagine their space. And then also on a much larger scale, like mass culture, like Beyonce's Formation, detourning like military drill team choreography. And then also one that all of you know very well, Project Row Houses, which was, of course, doing this thing of making a way out of no way, not just in these houses that were unkempt on a blighted block, and turning that into something that's rhythmically remade, not just with care, but with art installations, but also a model of affordable housing in a city with a crisis of that, and also a way of supporting young mothers. And of course, even now, with the Emancipation Economic Development Council remaking the process of gentrification. There's Bianca. And I wrote a 2-part article on Offsite about this, specifically of examples of artists in Third Ward doing this example, this survival creativity maneuver. So that is something that you can read as well. And then there's even larger examples, like in talking with Rick. Hey, Rick, what's a good example of like great creativity coming out of a dire circumstance? And he's like, Carrie, that's just the entire African-American experience in the United States. And I was like, oh yeah, of course, right. And he also said, but that comes out of thing is misleading, because it was obviously coming out of a very rich, dense, and ongoing cultural history that was just unperceptible to the people saying that it was somehow magic. So again, I'm looking in these concentric contexts, and I thought that I was trying to find this really earnest through line of going from a personal coping strategy to a shared ritual at the partner level, and then to a public catharsis again, because I was really fed up with social practice as a white art missionary project directed at people of color who've had their own forms of culture denied or displaced. And I thought narrowing my search to this would help me find it, but I actually just needed to look in the other direction. One obvious thing is that people with stakes in changing the way of the world and not just their own world often do this on their own just as a way of growing. And it was only the white capital-centric habit of disappearing sources, support, and struggle that made it hard to trace, especially in a contemporary professionalized art sphere, where the celebrity of the artist relies on deliberately hiding all the how-to or how our creativity may have derived as a way to navigate life experiences, because all people have that form of creativity. It makes artists less special if that's not platformed. So in other fields like behavioral neuroscience and somatic movement practices, which I talk about, it's actually really easy to find people who've worked with or around their own injury and gone on to share it as a mode of self-healing. So at the outset of my fellowship, I did research a lot of trauma studies, affect theory, visionary and self-taught artists, art therapy, psychotherapists using creative methods, cultural criticism, and contemporary theories of creativity. But I wanted more than just comments on the process from the outside. With my history organizing charge, and like Houston has a labor history, I know that it's really important that the voices of the primary producers are included. And in this case, I started with what I had access to, which was artists. And first with myself. So in the middle is a substructure timeline, and it's a research tool for plotting what creativity might come out of. And I made a how-to video also for the design studio for social intervention, so people could try it on their own practice, and also convened 6 artists to do it with their process as well. But the basic process is putting a horizon line, and all of your public-facing creative output goes above it. And then underneath the horizon line, not just directly tracing back, like already assuming what it comes out of, but laying in things like relationships, ongoing forms of support, life events, and all sort of things, and then looking to see if there's a rhythm. And I'm showing here the first iteration I made, and then the second one I'm working on now after working with other people on it, because the two things added are this third dimension and also the element of movement, which is basically the whole arc of my research. So I also visited Roberto Tejado's class at U of H, and I also, can you go back one? Whoever that one is. Yeah, thanks. But I was also aware that I'm asking this question, great creativity coming out of dire circumstances, which dovetails with questions of whether innovation comes out of necessity or abundance, productivity out of support or grit, progress out of bootstraps or mutual aid. In Houston, Texas, which I always say is a sculpture built by the artist neoliberal capitalism that prides itself as a DIY rescue wildcat or cowboy astronaut. So it's a very specific context for asking this question. And I had the opportunity to go ask it in kind of an opposite context, which is Taraneh Fazeli's series in New York about how states of debility are potentially resistant to capitalism's temporal bullying. And at this point, I'm able to kind of like plot the different responses on the spectrum of support and suffering. On the support side, it's a lot about environment, being so surrounded and saturated by great beauty and inspiration that it's just kind of what you breathe in and breathe out. On the suffering side, it's a lot about imagination, being forced to make a new way, a movement of last resort, as in having a hole in the ceiling, but no money and no material, which is Bijou. But there's also this weird and wide middle where people would be talking about their own process and it would cancel out. It would be like a little bit of pleasure and then some pain, or like some support and then it's taken away, and it was kind of more of a dance or a rhythm or a fight. So I started metabolizing the data as a poem and a drawing, printing the responses and rearranging them. And kind of a meta thing that happened with having the fellowship is that my personal origin of creativity had always come out of this very much on like the way out of no way side. But I was again having all this time, for the first time maybe since I was a kid, studio time, and really a feeling of support. And Ryan Sixto and Carol as my sounding board, and just this capacity to really find out like what does it look like when creativity doesn't have to come out of being under the gun, but what happens when it starts coming out of pleasure, et cetera. And it's addictive, so I'm gonna have to keep figuring out how to pull that off. And it's clear now at this point that great creativity comes out of all sorts of things, but when it comes out of dire circumstances, the interesting question is still how. Zooming in on the axis between making up when reality is untenable and making real to the point where it becomes a new reality. That's what was really interesting to me. And I was at a crossroads on the question of method because I wanted to do a large sound survey, but it turned out that what I would need to use for dire circumstances was standard quality of life metrics, and I wasn't sure about that because it seems so subjective and not commensurate between individuals. And on the creativity side, it was going to be grades in art classes, and I know that's bonkers because I've taught art classes and judged a lot of grants, and it just felt like these quantitative metrics were going to end up putting me in a defensive position because they don't even account for the existence of most of the juicy stuff I was finding, like everything under that horizon line, right? And then here, Jake's internal reporting of what his feeling of creativity feels like, which is this beautiful idea of deep wells. And actually having that defensive stance, again, helped me clarify what it was I was interested in, which was this sliver of becoming. So all of that was intro and methodology, and now we're going to switch to the first scale of the one to self in body and mind. And my example is the mirror box created by V.S. Ramachandran.
Suffered excruciating pain since he lost his hand 6 years ago.
A few days after I'd woke up, it might have been under a week to 8 or 9 days, something like that, before the pain really started getting bad, to where it was like your hand is just crunched up real tight and stuff, or balled up, and you can't move it. To unclench it, it's just, you can't. You've tried in your mind.
This raises a perplexing clinical problem. How do you treat pain in a body part that's missing? James tried everything, from painkillers to hypnotism, but nothing worked.
Until I found out about the mirror box.
It was then that he came to see Ramachandran.
And one answer might be that the brain is sending signals to the arm and trying to clench it. But in you and me, there's messages going back from the muscles of the hand telling you you're clenching too much or too fast. And this damps the command signals, so you can slow down. But the patient has no feedback because he doesn't have an arm. So the brain says, send even more signals, okay? And this goes on, and you get into a sort of positive feedback loop. So I said, well, if you give him some other source of feedback, such as visual feedback, maybe that'll trick the brain into thinking that the hand is clenching or unclenching, and maybe you can interrupt this loop. So I said, well, why don't we put a mirror there and have James look inside the mirror, just as though you have visually resurrected the phantom limb. And of course, the patient knows it's an illusion, but it's very, very compelling.
Right now, as you look in there and you move your hand, your phantom does the same thing as your left hand is doing. First time I got in here and I've done this, and it was just like, it relieved the phantom pain, unclenched it. It was just, so intriguing, sometimes it's hard to explain how you felt,
So that's actually, phantom limb pain happens in 80 to 90% of amputees, so it's really common phenomenon, and the mirror box is actually also one of the default methods of treating it now. That video's, from the 90s, but even now it's been, confirmed. This I'm not going to go into. Basically, I just loved Ramachandran so much that I ended up kind of writing this whole thing of what if creative people actually got to self-report on their role in contemporary ideas of neurobiology. So you could ask me about it later, but I'm going to skip ahead for the sake of time. Again, sort of getting into this method more of internal sensing, but extending it just from thinking from the neck up to the body. I was able to go to the Queer Tango Salon in London, and there I heard Lisa Blackman revisit this other famous adage, I think therefore I am, by Descartes, who was actually disabled and came up with this theory as I think a coping strategy for feeling that he could exist without his body, which I can relate to because my sort of origin myth of becoming an artist was being in an environment where it wasn't safe for me to move and express with my entire body, so I sort of channeled all of that into my hands. But I think the trick then is this process of moving back out. So Blackman says that, asked how many of these philosophers actually didn't move very much. Also citing Roland Barthes, known for his work on signs and what they signify, as another example. He also worked in a state of relative immobility. She also cites Sarah Ahmed and challenges the unshakable assumption that thinking is done from the neck up. And my additional challenge is again to this idea that knowing is all done with the mind. And when I got stuck on this drawing, which actually is behind this center screen, and you can come look at it when the talk's over, I zoomed out to my full body's involvement with it as a whole object, a whole wall in my house, and I started working on it as a dance. At this point, I could actually no longer resort to not using my body and sensing relative to it as the measure of making, for the simple fact that this is Houston, and within a year the pores of the paper had soaked up humidity and the weight of itself sagged and was warped so that no ruler or level could impose objective order. So basically I had to rely on this form of internal sensing. Also an example is the chair and how we know a chair. In Joseph Cassous' 1 and 3 chairs, it's a photograph, a physical chair, and a definition of a chair in language. But what about the body's interaction with the chair? Even now, as maybe for the first time this evening, your chairs are coming into focus as actually there. This kind of taken for granted support structure, relieving your body weight so that you can think about the ideas of this talk or whatever else you're occupied with besides holding up your spine and looking for a place of rest and relief. And what about the knowledge of the one who built the chair, who produced the intervention between us being tired and us being otherwise occupied? Elaine Scarry writes, "The shape of the chair is not the shape of the skeleton, the shape of the body weight, nor even the shape of pain perceived, but the shape of pain perceived, wished gone." This is jumping a little bit, and I don't want to cram a lot of Harvey in here because I haven't metabolized it yet, but I think it's important to the overall
I worked
art.
for the VA, and then the very first person I saw was a Vietnam veteran who had terrible nightmares, and I knew a little bit how to treat it, so I gave him some medicines to make the nightmares go away. And 2 weeks later he came back and I said, so how did the medicines work? And he said, I did not take your medicines because I realized I need to have my nightmares because I need to be a living memorial to my friends who died in Vietnam. And that statement was the opening of my fascination about how people become living testimonials for things that no longer exist, but they need to hold it in their hearts and minds and bodies and brains.
Else I read is you were reflecting on Hurricane Hugo, and hurricanes in general were natural disasters. This phenomenon we see of people helping each other, of getting out there and helping each other. And you also look at that and see that it's not just that people are helping each other, they're moving their bodies. Again, there's this physical involvement as kind of as an antidote to the helplessness of the situation, which is so manifest.
People talk a lot about stress hormones and how stress hormones are sort of the source of all evil. That's definitely not true. Stress hormones are good for you. You secrete stress hormones in order to give you the energy to cope under extreme situations. So it gives you that energy to stay up all night with your sick kid. What goes wrong is if you're kept from using your stress hormones. So if somebody ties you down, if somebody holds you down, if somebody keeps you imprisoned, the stress hormones keep going up, but you cannot discharge it with action. And then the stress hormones really start wreaking havoc with your own internal system. Right. But as long as you move, you are going to be fine. And so, as we know, after these hurricanes and these terrible things, people get very active and they like to help and they like to do things and they enjoy doing it because it discharges their energy.
So we are healing ourselves, or we don't realize that, but
we're using
we know
our
how
natural
to
system, basically. It's not only healing, we're coping, we're just dealing with what we need to cope with. That's why you have that stuff. Right. That's why we survive as a species. Right. And so what is disturbing in Hurricane Hugo, and what we saw again in New Orleans, is how these victimized populations were prevented from doing something. And that's really what the observation was.
And that compounded the trauma.
Yeah. So I get flown into Puerto Rico after Hurricane Hugo because I've written a book about trauma. I knew nothing about disasters, but nobody else knew anything either, so they flew me in. And what struck me, I landed in Puerto Rico, and everybody is busy doing stuff and building things, and everybody's too busy to talk to me because they're trying to do stuff. But on the same plane that I flew in with, officials from FEMA came in, who then made announcements, stop your work until FEMA decides what you're going to get reimbursed for.
Right.
And that was the worst thing that could have happened, because now these people were using the energy to fight with each other and to pick quarrels with each other instead of rebuilding their houses. And that's, of course, similar what happened in New Orleans, where people also were kept from being agents in their own recovery.
I've bookend that later, don't worry. Okay, so there's a small exercise I want to do, which is that if you'll interlace your fingers and look at your hands and sort of have them up a little bit near your chest or your eyes. And then if you just move one finger over, so interlace them, but just one finger over, like one finger down or up. And see if, the first time I did this, I had this really uncanny sensation of like, whose hands are those? Just because it was sort of outside of the habit of what I was used to doing. That's good, y'all can stop. This is an example from the field of somatics, which is, it emphasizes internal physical perception and experience instead of like, dancing as a performance for an external audience. And I found it because, again, looking for examples from the personal coping strategy to the public scale, actually, somatics is something where you're both internally sensing, but you can perform it with a group. And it's having a huge moment in the United States as somatics for social justice or generative somatics, and also being reconfirmed by all of this neurology and brain imaging. And it was so popular in the States that I signed up to go in Berlin. And when I was there studying with Katja Munker, I was out of my element, right, because I'm an artist. So I was looking for the objects in the room, and there were these meditation pillows, but for me, they're like somehow these cartoon pillows of like big red buttons and like emergency. So she would give us like 6 minutes to do a thing, and I said, okay, well, what I'm going to do is move these pillows from one side of the studio to the other, and I said, if you see me reach the halfway mark, you can help. And so I start attacking them full on with my body, and I'm like flinging them and pushing them with my thighs, and at one point my like face is crammed into them, and I'm still pushing them with my hips, and I'm just like in this huge urgent emergency state. And it never occurs to me that I also could have just like picked up a stack and walked across the room and put it down. And I was like, what was that was my only option? And I'm like, okay, where am I? Or where was I? And I was like, okay, I'm in the hospital, and my mom is sick, and it seems like nobody's going to help, and time's running out. And that was my physical state. And so that was 7 years previous to this experience, and somehow this association was still linked, like taking care of things, just moving pillows, with taking care of my mom. And this is kind of one of the claims of somatics, is that you're able to sort of perform another version of yourself before you even realize that you can't, that like that's not how you behave, right? And this is also interestingly like my sort of story of how deep this symbol was embedded for me. There's a neurobiologist called Robert Sapolsky who talks a lot about how our the human power for abstraction actually got built and piggybacked on the part of our brain that processes physical symbols. So when we're morally disgusted by something, it's actually riding on our gustatory response, or what would have kept us from dying by eating rotten food. So even now with brain imaging, you can see that whether somebody eats rotten food, smells somebody else eating rotten food, or sees an old woman being kicked in the street, it's the same part of your brain that's lighting up, because humans are actually pretty bad at telling the difference, which makes, of course, the symbolic an incredibly powerful realm. And artists, I think, have a lot to do with intervening in that. And I think that's my main point for here. So back to art. Lewis Hyde describes how our word art comes from an ancient root that means to join and to make. Many other modern words come from the same root, all of them having to do with joints in one sense or another. Arthritis is a disease of the joints, and arthropod is an insect with jointed legs. Articulate usually denotes clarity of speech, but one can also articulate a skeleton, which is to say, assemble it joint by joint. His main point is that artists are tricksters, and tricksters are tactical joint workers, boundary crossers, finding the limits and violating them, or keeping them lively. So in all of these senses, taking things that are locked in a stuck relationship with no possibility of movement, and kind of slipping in that joint and reworking it. And then this is a quote from my mixed race trans movement artist friend, calling out how, generative somatics, it might just be like a white way of reinventing or rebranding Indigenous and people of color intuitive knowledge systems, because it was created or coalesced mostly around the 70s by mostly white people in Berkeley. So again, this is not like the end-all be-all. These forms of knowing and self-healing are all across the board, including Tai Chi, etc. But this was just the access that I had at the time. But it got me thinking, like, you know, maybe it's not just neuroplasticity, maybe there's also social and political plasticity. So instead of on a personal level, anytime we face a threat, like our only option is to fight, flight, or freeze, what if there's all of these other possible options? And also, and like, you know, living in a time of polytraumas, we of course need more than just 3 responses. We should also just recognize, as Zave calls out, that not everyone ever narrowed it down to 3. And then on social level, what if instead of this constant blow to blow to blow, we're taking our enemy as a dance partner? So these are sock and bop and robots that I've photoshopped into a queer tango embrace, where actually the follow is leading a boleo. And then on a political level, what if instead of like move and counter move, we make more space, like hacking into a given frame, but inverting the attention. Here we are at the partner level. One of my advisors was Alayo Aramo, who's an anarcho-feminist queer tango activist who got tired of writing and theorizing about gender and started learning contact tango, or contact improv and tango. And in this video, it's sort of a mix of both, but it shows the axis well. And you might think that from the symbol of tango, it's a very heteronormative lead-follow dynamic, but on the inside, the roles are much more reciprocal and collaborative, and actually tango is improvisational. Further than that, on a queer tango dance floor, you never know when you see 2 people emerge on the floor towards each other who will lead and who will follow, because it's constantly switching back and forth, making new gender and relationships and roles, and negotiating things physically through the embodied politics inscribed on all our bodies. And her practice includes forensically reading back into the dance by embodying hypothetical origin myths. So not just by taking the dominant narrative for granted that tango started in close quarters by men dancing together, which erases the possibility that women co-invented tango, but actually in her workshops, what you'll do is like dance a song as if tango started as a knife fight, dance a song as if tango started as a hustle and you're, you know, working in a brothel, dance tango as if it's a seduction and you're trying to, you know, get this person to be with you for life, and etc. And then from that moment, seeing what echoes in our bodies so long later, what sort of holds there and resonates. And I asked her, like, why is tango still popular? Because it's like 150 years later, whereas salsa was just invented in the 70s. And she says that despite all the gentrification done to the dance, it's because of the huge energy shared in the axis of the 2 dancers' solar plexus and the illusion of fusion with your partner. So I'm thinking of tango as a kind of dancing mirror box, because again, tango is improvisational, so there's no set steps, but what there is the axis across which you mirror your partner's movements. And if we think about what's happening in the mirror box on a relational level, it's that the physically present hand becomes empathetic and clinches for the phantom, meeting it in its moment of stuck pain, taking on its position as a surrogate and releasing it. And so they're reconciled in this moment of lending sensing to one another, substantiating their counterpart, sharing an axis, and reconvening in the simultaneous or synced up perception. And here we go up to the sort of more political scale. Another element of that mirror box is surprise, right? So even though James has felt his phantom limb there for years, when he sees it visually and his world, his internal sensing is linked up with the visual output, he even has this moment of surprise, like, oh, it's there. So in these examples of the inflatable cobblestones used throughout Europe, sorry, I can't find it. It's basically that, you know, this element, are introduced, and the police don't have a habit for responding to that. And with no habit for responding to that, a new possibility can emerge. So I'm collecting these examples, basically, or I have been. These are all collected already because I'm in a cohort of 20 progressive leaders called New Leaders Council, and it's just Chris Valdez and I who are the artists, and we have the weirdest ideas. And they keep saying, like, keep them coming. So I keep them coming, and I end up creating this, like, creative tactic toolkit video, which is on YouTube. But one of the most powerful examples that I found is the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials, which comes out of Chicago having this hidden history of torture where their police chief for 2 decades, using tactics he had learned in Vietnam, was secretly torturing inmates. And the city was silent on this. It wasn't a known thing that had happened. And so with a coalition of survivors, their families, attorneys, activists, artists, and educators, what they did was put out a speculative call for memorials. So all these citizens of Chicago turned in how they would memorialize this. And it was not sculptures on plinths. It was things like, oh my God, I know that when you see a chair now, how do you think even of a chair as like something that's going to help and sustain and support you, and that was something used to abuse you. So these beautiful memorials that take on this other lens of their perspective having gone through that experience are things like a gesture that every person in Chicago would perform in the morning in remembrance. And so they had this exhibition, and Alice Kim, who I was able to talk to about it, talks about this moment in the exhibition where the survivors, again, looking at all of these examples, felt witnessed and were re-substantiated again, but as survivors, not victims of this, but as people that had lived through it. Elaine Scarry talks a lot about, because when she writes, she's writing with the primary sources from Amnesty International of torture survivors and also people that write in and protest, lending their voice to people who aren't voiceless, but whose voice has been taken away because they're confined. And I sort of think of this example as like the whole city of Chicago is putting up these mirrors, like I see you, it happened, I see you, it happened, here's this, here's how we move on. And it actually ended up, they drafted this reparations bill, which was in the art exhibition, but then it actually passed city council, including things like public education about this history in the schools. That's an amazing example. Oh, sorry. So again, on this it's not there denied side, there's lists of so many things that are there. The body, racism, white supremacy, the female orgasm, other subjectivities. We could all list a lot of things. But the mirror box is so compelling because it's a performance of a function not often performed in our society. We have so much more practice with this other side coming up. And artists and activists and whoever still has their empathy intact are left inserting these mirrors, hoping another side might catch a glimpse, a glitch of themselves in it. To scale back down to a personal level, to Van der Kolk saying a person becomes a living memorial to trauma that no one else witnessed, sometimes I think of these sort of empathy havers in this way, absorbing the pain, and it gets clenched in a positive feedback loop because the other substantiated and dominant hand refuses to relate to, have empathy for, mirror, or become a partner with the side that's experienced loss. Instead, blaming the denied side, like clinching it further for its own lack of healing, and in this turning away, ensure that the scream just has to keep on cycling. Now not even in an abstract way, but in the bodies of the individual people who hold it. Elaine Scarry also talks about an item can be a weapon or a tool depending on whether the surface it acts on has sentience, which, you know, in the gentrification example, the developers are saying there's no life here. But in this example, these are shields, mirror shields from Standing Rock. A mirror shield, a sliver of surface that reflects so much more than its surface area, that flips the world over.
Can you sum up for me, what do you hope to accomplish by this occupation?
An American Indian nation comprising of all the tribes, including the Alaskans.
Why Alcatraz?
Everybody can see it. On one end of the country, you have the Statue of Liberty, and it's just the opposite. You have a true reality of liberty.
Do you think you have the legal right to claim the island? And why?
Well, you're talking about two different societies now. In my society, or in the Indian society, yes, we do. All right, I have a proclamation I'd like to read you. We, the Native Americans, reclaim this land known as Alcatraz Island in the name of all American Indians by right of discovery. We wish to be fair and honorable in our dealings with the Caucasian inhabitants of this land, and hereby offer the following treaty. We will purchase said Alcatraz Island for $24 in glass beads and red cloth, a precedent set by the white man's purchase of a similar island about 300 years ago. We know that $24 in trade goods for these 16 acres is more than was paid when Manhattan Island was sold, but we know that land values have risen over the years. Our offer of $1.24 per acre is greater than the 47 cents per acre the white man is now paying the California Indians for their land. We will give to the inhabitants of this island a portion of that land for their own, to be held in trust by the American Indian government. For as long as the sun shall rise and the rivers go down to the sea, to be administered by the Bureau of Caucasian Affairs. We will further guide the inhabitants in the proper way of living. We will offer them our religion, our education, our life ways, in order to help them achieve our level of civilization and thus raise them and all their white brothers up from their savage and unhappy state. We offer this treaty in good faith and wish to be fair and honorable in our dealings with all white men.
Okay, so in presenting this to me, what do you want me to do with it? Do you have anything in mind?
Hold on to it.
Okay.
React to it.
Okay. But they say they'll continue to press their claim for the island and the center they could build here by legal means. That claim, they say, is a just one and a fair one. Mike Mills for Newswatch on Alcatraz.
So these are all examples, again, from this political scale, and a year of hearing from my NLC cohort that and from lots of activists that they wanted more creative ways than just the same approaches, and then on the art side, everybody wanting to plug in with political relevance after the election. So I thought, well, let's bring them together. So we, on the invitation of Diverse Works, as part of the Lines Drawn show that was curated by Xandra Eden and in collaboration with Arts Take Action Houston, I organized this artist activist matchmaking event. And it took 9 months to organize, so I'm like glossing over a lot, but I had all these great advisors. And we had 6 different issue areas hosted by a subject matter expert activist host. And people could sign up and, can you press play on the, that's 6 dose. And people could sign up and sort of do their homework and their background work on it. And then we went through a series of brainstorming exercises. And also Ronnie and I took all these videos, which is footage that they could use for their cause in whatever way they wanted. And so through this series of exercises, what we also did, because each of these issues involves violence to the body, and also because the whole point was like to unstick stuck issues, we didn't want us to be stuck in our chairs. So Abijan Johnson led dance movement therapy-inspired rhythmic group activity, and Makiva McNeil sonically stewarded the event. And this week I've gotten to hear people's feedback and like the ways that they're still working on into the future and the projects they're doing, which is amazing, and I'm still collecting and it's still unfolding. But one really interesting thing that happened from the night of the event was that although these people were in the fight of their lives at the time, like it was a week of DACA, I mean, it was really crunch time, and but the room that night was so full of like laughter, which was really incredible. And then also 3 out of the 6 groups ended up coming with ideas that they shared in the shareback, which were essentially this kind of role switching or forcing a mirror box, for example, with a politician passing legislation that would then have to experience the effects, or switching people's point of view sort of across this way. And then the other thing is that, of course, the work of BLM, HTX, and NBUF, who's doing community-based Harvey relief, was very much about giving every experiencer of the hurricane agency in their own transformation and healing and mucking, which is really powerful. So I'm almost done. Thinking, of course, about Audre Lorde, and that not only is it not effective to use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, and not only can the fight be negated by taking the shape only legible within your enemy's language, but it's also missing this incredible opportunity. Because thinking back to Descartes, perhaps actually this enemy doesn't have access to this high-resolution sensorium tool. Perhaps it's actually impossible to be a sensing and embodied and remain attached to an ideology of violent negation, claiming it's not there to any articulation seen as interference. These are just 2 instances from TV imaginations of fascist regime that are brought down from the inside by a confrontation with an undeniable physical reality, a son who's sick and a need to be sexually expressive. And then after all, there are actual mirror neurons So the same part of our brain will light up whether an action is done directly to us or whether we watch another person experiencing it. Ramachandran has proven this in people with swollen, paralyzed limbs. Watching the hand even of another person being massaged can alleviate swelling and activate sensation. It's the habit of repressing this response that denies it, not because it's a fundamental human reality that it's not there. I'm just going to give Octavia Butler the last word.
Found a refuge in the limitless world of science fiction. She began writing her own stories at 10. At 13, she began sending her work out to be published. For decades and over a dozen novels later, she has established herself as one of the most respected science fiction writers working today. Her work draws praise and distinction for its exploration of feminist and racial themes. In 1995, she became the recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant. Her most recent book, Parables of the Talents, is currently nominated for the Nebula Award for Best Novel. Why science fiction?
Because there are no closed doors, no walls. I mean, the only rule is if you use science, you should use it accurately. You can look at, examine, play with anything, absolutely anything.
Are you surprised that you became a writer?
Oh, no. No, I think I had one choice. Well, two choices. I could become a writer or I could die really young. Because there wasn't anything else that I wanted.
But was it about writing for you?
Oh, you got to make your own worlds. You got to write yourself in. Whether you were a part of the greater society or not, you got to write yourself in. So I got to write myself in.
In her series that she writes, she has a character called Anwanyu that can basically scale into her body in high resolution. Every change she made in her body had to be understood and visualized. If she was sick or injured, she could not simply wish to be well. She could be killed as easily as anyone else if her body was damaged in some way that she could not understand quickly enough to repair. Thus, she'd spent most of her long life learning the diseases, disorders, and injuries that she could suffer, learning them often by inflicting mild versions of them on herself, then slowly, painfully, by trial and error, coming to understand exactly what was wrong and how to impress healing. Thus, when her enemies came to kill her, she knew more about surviving than they did about killing. I'm going to stop there. Thank you. This is the drawing. It's sort of like this idea that when the imagination is done doing this work, it disappears. So I wanted this really like low relief way of registering all these often invisible sort of support structures, which is how I made it. Yes?
I had a question. How many people did you interview for when you asked the question about are you more creative
when you're suffering? Wait, sorry.
When you're you took a survey of people and asked them if they were more creative when they were suffering.
Yeah.
How many people did you?
That was only 5 from Roberto Tejada's class. And from that point, I wanted to move on, again, to do that like formal survey, which never materialized. But I love that part because it's like the answer yes is not even, like nobody answered yes. Oh, really? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I feel like it's whenever it's changed.
What do you want to say more? I mean, I'm still, okay, cool.
I would like to echo that.
Yeah.
I create when I'm depressed or sad. Like the yarn installations that I do are all like from all that. So yeah, most everything I do is based on like being lonely or being sad. Like almost every single project that I have.
Does something have to launch it, or does it just? I can definitely relate. Like I totally have that experience. That's most of my creative existence is like only creating when I'm not sure if I'm going to exist if I don't make a thing, like to prove to myself that whatever. But I was asking you, like, is it when you're in that state, does it just then happen, or are there other things you have to do to kind of like make that be what you do instead of sit in bed, etc.?
I feel like it comes out of me in vomits.
Yeah.
Think of it like vomit, or like it just comes out. It's this huge thing, and I didn't know where it came from.
Same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like trying to find a solution for a thing. Like, how do you get people to talk to you or hang out with you and create a project where they have to?
And that is social practice.
Can we talk a little bit about, well, first of all, I just want to say that I've followed your practice for quite some time. Very layered and dense, and it reveals a lot to me when I leave it, after I've experienced it at this scope. But then I have to step back, and then it just kind of unfolds in time because of all the layers, and I think that that's just your process. But there's also something in that density, there's also something that's very intimate about much of your work. And I think about the installation that you did at your mother's house, where no one was there, and I walked into the house and I was by myself in your old childhood home. And there's these and there's also this level of mapping too. But it seems like a thread that's kind of, that seems to be through all your work and all the forms that it manifests, is exploring trauma and the senses. And I was just sharing a text with a friend here, and it was from Christina Sharp, and she said something about the kind of understanding the violence of the word, and that kind of being embedded in kind of language. So it makes me think about sensation and your inclination to create these multiple platforms for sensation. But what happens is that it's so challenging. Often, you don't always, you have this space where you just don't have the words for it because we're absorbing it right now in our bodies. We're trying to put all this information in different places. And so, but I guess I'm saying that to kind of tell you, I'm synthesizing it as I'm saying it. But I'm also curious, two questions. If you can talk a little bit about trauma in your own work and what this residency kind of has revealed to you, because like I said, it's been threaded kind of throughout all of your work for some years, and where you're at now on kind of, if you don't mind, on a really personal level, because the work is so personal. And I think I'll leave it at that, actually.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a thread of my work, because what y'all are saying about this just coming out of you, yeah, I've had that experience and it's so amazing, and that's why I'm interested in it, because I believe it, and I'm like, what is that? How is that thing make something possible in a realm where nothing seems possible, right? But to answer that question, I think one thing to note is what the fellowship gave me again in moving into this sense of being able to use all of my senses, thinking below my neck, using my body, is sort of a checkpoint would be if you'd asked me at the beginning, describe your leg, what's your sensation of your leg? I would have said it's a vague column filled of mashed potatoes or something. There wasn't a lot of sensation happening. And through just learning to sense it more, but also the main thing I found was that actually it was like that because I injured it some years ago, and it then got sort of stuck in this mode of always being afraid it would be re-injured and would not take any other input. But that also meant that because that was this ongoing habit, it was really easy to go back to the point when it started, which is right before it fell, and then from that mode very slowly try to move in a different direction and see if I could get my hip to collaborate with my foot and see if I could sense the ground. And I guess my answer is just that so much more feels recruitable in me than when my only tool was just the visual art. And that's something that the fellowship's given me. And it means that when I'm faced with these threats or even memories of trauma that's happened in the past, I do feel I have a lot more maneuvers. I think that's sort of why I'm so fixated on this idea. But it's something about like Olaya's thing, being able to see a habit that's stuck, and then read back into it kind of forensically to how it started, and then from there launch in a new direction. Because you can't start launching in a new direction, like just like, you know, in the example, unclench your hand. You can't just like, you have to somehow arrive and maybe steep a little bit in that moment of trauma, which is often everything we don't want to do. And from there, you know, open your eyes and like, actually there's a door to the room and there's a world outside, and like, that also will pass. So I think that's sort of what I'm thinking. I mean, I feel probably better than I've ever felt in my life, if that's an answer to your question.
I'm sorry to do that. And I will just say kind of one other thing is this idea of kind of standing within it.
Yeah.
And it seems like just a kind of observance is that the work seems to really be about, instead of kind of running away from it, to actually stand within that space and actually kind of articulate and to allow that to be kind of this kind of fertile kind of a space. Because we look at the work and we go into these pristine spaces or outside and it's still pristine. But then it seems from what I've gotten from this is that it becomes about going beyond that and looking at what informs that and these moments of catharsis. So it makes me go look beyond these the final kind of things that we are presented with from the artist. So.
But also, I never would have gotten there without you. So. Julia.
I love the kind of metaphor of the mirror box, and it makes so much sense when it's your own body, but then taking it on to like reflecting other people and creating feeling reflecting through other people. The thought I kept having is that there has to be the connection. Like connection has to be there. Like when you're doing it with yourself, you have that connection. You move it's part of you. So I noticed, like in the using it as a tool in activism, I think that it could only work when connection is there. It seems like it's often like a request for.
Yeah.
Do you think it has to be back and forth? I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
I don't know. That's what I was saying. Like the image to me is like in all of these situations where the activists are doing all of these actions, like the other hand is just not showing up, or like worse is like making it worse, and then just yeah. I think the tool is like, how do we get? I don't know. How do you get there? How do you like? You can't force empathy, but it's inspiring to me, which is why I think I kept riffing on these neurologists, is that again, like it actually is a response. Like you will respond to another human body, human being. Your system will do it. It's just the habit of repressing that response that makes it seem as if that's not human nature, which is not actually the case. Yeah. So, yeah, it does have to have that connection. I don't know how we get there, but I know that it seems like the trick or the important part. Yeah.
But wouldn't it be that sometimes they wouldn't even like need sympathy from the other side, but more of a resistance?
Yeah.
More of an act of like, I'm here, I don't care what you think, this is, we've always been here, or whatever the message is.
Yeah, also that with like so then there's like the mirror shield, which is like, I'm not here so you can connect with me and reflect me. I'm here to show you yourself, which maybe you haven't taken a look at, Yeah. Yeah.
Related to what you said back there, and I think this is something that I've been thinking through in some of my research too, is how motion pictures and fiction help us kind of empathize or see something within ourselves that we have been ignoring. So, we're very used to these images of crisis all over, but then when we see it in a movie or when we see it in a video, it kind of solicits something else. And I think fiction is kind of what a lot of artists are working with today to kind of go through that. And it kind of parallels the same thing that happens with the mirror boxing thing. So it just kind of, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, there's, it's not up anymore, but where do I start? So that's why Octavia Butler's in there, because she's writing about these realities in which, for example, depression is a disease of empathy response that you can't shield from. And she's writing that in like 70, right? And that's actually confirmed now, it was in 2011. Or then the example, which is really interesting, of like, and I have a picture, but you can't see it. So there's these baby seagulls that their mother has like a little red dot on their beak, and so the little baby seagulls will always go like punch the beak, and it turns out that that's like all that they recognize. So there was a scientist that tried this with an abstract, just like white stick with a red dot, and the seagulls would still punch it, right? And it's like this idea of like the brain's way of responding to the symbol. And Ramachandran uses it as an example, and he's like, well, that's why artists are genius, because they hit the response center, because they know how to tap into that formula. But actually, that's like only half of it, because what we get to do using fiction or using things we make up or using things that aren't strict reality is like push it further, right? Like even push and distort and abstract that dot even more, so that how humans are evolving is potentially sort of going in this direction more. But I definitely wouldn't have gotten through this if I wasn't also listening to Octavia Butler and like getting to get in her world for a while, because it's a way of being in a realm of completely different possibilities. Yeah. So I'm with you on that. Yeah, Laura.
So I was thinking about mirrors and how mirrors show a reverse image of yourself. And then it can also shine, you shine a light, you can reflect. And another point about fiction is if you make something up, but everyone else thinks it's real, it is real. It becomes reality. Or you can change your own past by envisioning something that went differently, and then it becomes real, and then it biologically changes you. I think that is the kind of beauty of art out of trauma, or either you can vision something else.
Yeah, there's two more Butler examples. One is like in 1998, she writes about a fascist regime coming to power using the slogan, "Make America Great Again." And then she also has a series that's all about this like this parasitic basically ruler who's selectively breeding people called Doro, and it has to be parasitic, and that's the only way that systems can work, and that's the only way social bonds can happen. But then she introduces this other character that congregates people because they like being around other people with similar gifts. And then in the next generation, the character is not parasitic, she's actually a symbiont, and she's sort of the hub of this wheel of interchanging and reciprocal dynamics between people. So yeah, it's like this full arc of like, what are we stuck with, and what else can there be that's so powerful? And also those mirrors, yeah, thanks also for giving those thoughts about what else mirrors can do.
Okay, so thank you very much, Carrie.